Thank you very much. Namaste, salam alaikum. Kemon acho? Palo, that's good to hear. It's great. I've been to Dhaka just once earlier, and it's wonderful to be back. It's wonderful to be at the Dhaka Lit Fest and to see such a terrific audience. I hope you have lots of questions at the end of our session. And I'm delighted, pleased and honored to be interviewed by someone as beautiful, as accomplished, and a person from a school that my children went to. So that's a special qualification. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you for this opportunity for us to talk together.
So my first question actually comes from a personal memory. Growing up Bangali in Bombay, that really sort of came together in the 10 days of Durga Puja. So every year I'd be at Tejpal Hall, which is a very beautiful but very well-behaved puja. And then always on Shaptami or Navami, suddenly there would be this electric current in the hall, and there would be this sort of energy going around, and all the guards would tuck their shirts into their pants and throw out their pans, and all these uncles, denizens of the corporate world, would also be smoothing their kurtas and their dhutis and the little hair they have left on their head. And then it would become clear why. It's because Shobha Dev was here to give Anjali.
Don't believe a word of it.
And then she would walk in the door, and you were always beautifully dressed, and you would look like this beautiful icon. And I guess I want to start with that question. What is it like balancing being the person, Shobha, with what Indian media likes to call the personality?
I think the trick in life for anybody at any stage, no matter how big or small you may be, is to remember to be yourself. And that's it. You don't get carried away. You don't buy into your own mythology. Most of it is rubbish to start with. And these are perceptions. These are perceptions sometimes you may have maybe unconsciously played into, not by design, by what you say, the way you appear in public, your persona. But if you start taking the persona seriously and you start getting confused about your own identity, then you're in big trouble.
So Shobha, how would you define your identity?
I would say, honestly, very truthfully, with my hand on my heart, it's that of a middle-class, hard-working Maharashtrian mother.
Really?
Completely. I mean, that is the person I most identify with. That is the person I like in the many versions of myself that I sometimes recognize, sometimes I don't, in the public domain. And that is a person I also respect within myself more than any of the other roles that sometimes are thrust on you, sometimes you opt for them, sometimes you have fun with them. But mainly it's important, if you have an image at all of your own creation or something that you have acquired over a period of time, and I've been writing now for 45 years, the least you can do is enjoy it and have fun with it. And like Disraeli advised his queen, I've never forgotten those words, and I remind myself about them always and always. Never explain and never complain.
You are the author of 18 novels, each of which have hit bestseller, the top bestseller lists in India. You are known as one of India's most trusted people, according to Reader's Digest, and that list, by the way, includes Ratan Tata and Dr. Abdul Kalam. You're on the list of 50 most powerful women of India. You're on the list of 50 most powerful people of India. You're one of the most searched Indian women Indian women. And India Today recently called you one of 5 great Indian writers. So yes, middle-class Maharashtrian mother, but how do you put all of these pieces together? And how do you find time to write?
Between lit fests. I'm telling you, there's no shortcut to what anybody does. Writing by itself is a discipline that consumes most of my waking hours and quite often my sleeping hours as well. Because I think a writer or any person in the creative field, you never really stop writing, you never stop thinking, you never stop visualizing, you never stop. Anything and everything is in some way, directly or indirectly, an inspiration without sometimes you're even knowing it. Like what's troubling me the most today, I had a very intense edit meet with my team. I'm also a publisher. So we had an intense edit meet where we were discussing titles for which we were planning for 2017, 2018. So there were these ideas going back and forth, and everybody's firing on all cylinders. And there was a remark made by a young person from the sales team who I had not met previously, a guy called Rahul, who I liked very much because he was self-effacing, he was a good professional. He's a very senior guy, but he had no ego about taking notes because normally, as you might have noticed, as most of us might have noticed, when there's a meeting and there's one lady present, it's normally the person someone else turns to her and says, why don't you keep the minutes, why don't you take notes, regardless. This was one time, there was one guy, we were all women, and he was an equal in terms of seniority, everything in the setup. And he was just doing it so naturally. And that image of Rahul sitting at my dining table, everything happens around my dining table. I don't have an office, I don't have staff. I'm my own everything, my own telephone operator, my own secretary, my own everything. And there is Rahul at my dining table. It's the first time we're meeting. And I said, my God, there's a story right there. I mean, the Rahul story, how things have changed. To me, it was a symbol of a lot of change because he didn't feel bashful. He didn't feel he was lowering himself. And in a society, in the region where the disparities between men and women, their roles within an office, workplace, family are so defined and so almost cast in stone. I think they're breaking, and for me that was a very positive sign of all that is possible. It hasn't happened yet, but it's happening.
It's so nice to hear that. Actually, one of the questions I had for you, one of the reasons I follow you is because you write so bravely and with such wit about feminism, something that's very dear to my heart. So I was actually going to ask you, do you think that from the time you published your first novel in 1989, which, by the way, made the waves because, well, one of the reasons it made the waves, other than the wonderful writing, was because a woman walked out of her marriage, not because she was abused, or not because something terrible was happening to her, but because, as Shobha said, she was bored. And Indian society had a really hard time with this. People had a very hard time with the fact that a woman could be a novel could be about a protagonist where a woman has the right to walk out of her marriage, not because something terrible is happening, but because she just doesn't want to be in it anymore. So as you've been writing over the last several years, do you see a real positive change in the roles women are allowed to play and do play?
Well, I will paraphrase one of your sentences that you used just now when you said a woman has a right, and I'll say a woman has a right, full stop. And I don't feel women need to constantly justify those rights and explain those rights and defend those rights and constantly have to make apologies for the rights that are naturally theirs. So to me, feminism really is something very, very simple. Feminism is equality. And as equal human beings, as equal partners, there ought to be mutual respect. But yes, when I wrote that book, and that was a good 30 years ago, it was considered absolutely, shocking that here's a person who has a nice bloke as a husband, but just a very boring bloke, So the idea of spending the next 30, 40 years of her life getting bored out of her skull, and I think there was a scene in that, and there was no explicit sex in it whatsoever. It was just something that was suggested and in a way that was, I think, far more powerful when you say that if she is lying in bed and he's doing his business, and all she can think of is the ear stud, the back of which is poking into her neck, and she's doing her daily hisab and saying, well, get on with it and can we just get over this? And that's what 90% of women do think, but they never articulate it because it's not condoned by society, and it's certainly not understood by the men in their lives. That there can be something way beyond marital obligatory union, which is part of some kind of an imaginary contract that is signed when you sign up for marriage itself. And I find that extremely unequal in terms of a woman's rights over her own body, how she feels, whether she, even as a wife, can feel a sense of assault, whether she can feel, and domestic rape is a very serious issue, which we sweep under the carpet. I don't mean every time you sleep with your husband it's rape, but there may be times when a woman may not wish to, and if a person is forced into it, then to me it is really something very, very, actually quite tragic and sad, because she's forced to endure something that she doesn't enjoy 90% of the time.
And actually, marital rape is not recognized in almost all of the South Asian countries. But speaking of sex, in your later novels, you are very explicit about sex. You're very explicit about feeling sensations to do with sex. But what's been much more interesting for me is the reaction of the media to that. Shobha, do you think Indian media is obsessed with sex?
Tell me who isn't obsessed with sex? Why the Indian media? The whole world is obsessed with sex. It's just that when, I think at the time it was perhaps, it was before 50 Shades of Grey and 160 Shades of Black and White and Blue and everything else. It was ahead of the curve that a woman from this region could write about sex from a woman's perspective. It wasn't about eroticism at all. It was really about how, even the Kama Sutra is written by a man. So we rarely get to know how women feel. And it's important to get those perspectives in place as well. And that a woman has a right to articulate how it must be for the pleasurable part of it, the not so pleasurable part of it, just to be able to treat it in an upfront way, like men have always treated it in an upfront way without any questions asked. So when I was repeatedly asked these questions somehow, and of course when it comes to a woman writing about sex quite explicitly, questions from the audience, there's a vicarious interest in knowing, but madam, is it about your life? Is it about your experience? I said, do you ever ask Khushwant Singh that question? So yes, you need a sense of humor, because if you're going to get all huffy about it and all defensive about it, you already are given the advantage to the other person, who then has the right to further make you feel. The idea of just making a woman cringe or making a woman uncomfortable is something, across the world we face that, and I think Nayanthara Sehgal put it wonderfully well at an earlier Lit Fest, where she said that self-censorship comes from women themselves, because everything in society is kind of, the odds are against you. To speak about this is not alright, to speak about that is not okay, that is taboo. Why can't you write? Like I was actually told earlier on, 30 years ago, that why can't you write the books like other writers, like other women are writing? Like why can't they be about suppression, depression, oppression, repression? A kind of a jaunty, happy read from a woman from this region was not considered good enough. Then it had to be categorized. It had to be categorized. Like a gentleman here came up to me a little timidly as I walked in and wanted a selfie. I think he looked around to see whether his wife was around. And then he said to me, I'm coming to attend your session, but my wife said, why would you want to attend her session? Her books are, yes, I said, yes, yes, you don't have to define it, you don't have to spell it out. I'm sure he's there somewhere, and I'm sure he's right there.
So Shobha, you recently wrote a book on marriage. And I was thinking, if you had to describe to a Martian this institution of marriage, what would you say?
I would say that a better alternative hasn't been found so far, so just live with it.
Speaking of the reaction of media to a lot of the things you've said, I wanted to share with this audience specifically some of your recent tweets and articles that I have particularly enjoyed and that I think you will too. So recently, after a Muslim man was lynched in Dadri for allegedly eating beef, Shobha tweeted, "I just ate beef, come and murder me. After Narendra Modi just went to London for his trip, she wrote a very tongue-in-cheek, lovely, sly article called "Pussycat, Pussycat, Where Have You Been?" The Indian government, along with many governments in the region, has been having some trouble with figuring out what we are allowed to read and watch and see and experience. And Shobha wrote this lovely piece, and the name of the piece was, "Dear Government, Hands Off My Porn." And then the first line I also thought was brilliant, and I wanted to share with you. "The barely there fig leaf over the government's progressive thinking wilted and fell off like an unused condom." What I wanted to ask you was, and this is this last one is, she also has a crush on the governor of the Central Bank of India, as do I. And she says, she wrote about him calling it the unbearable hotness of Raghuram Rajan. Fully agree with you on that one. But hitting very close to home, when beef was banned in Maharashtra, and by the way, Maharashtra has a significant Muslim population, and beef is one of the cheaper forms of protein available to the poor. You wrote, "This is not the Maharashtra we love, nako nako," which means no, no in Marathi, "ye sab roko." And then I think there was a Shiv Sena lawyer who wanted you to apologize, and you even got a notice from the Supreme Court to explain yourself.
Let me just put that into context. Most of the people who respond to my tweets and respond to them violently don't know English, don't read English, don't speak English. They are told by someone, "She has written something truly terrible." Then it's translated into one of various languages. And then the literal translation can, as you know, sometimes go completely, I don't even know where it goes. So at any rate, after one of those tweets, one of our, in the Legislative Assembly, in the Maharashtra Legislative Assembly, a privilege motion was brought against me. Now, the idea, when something like this happens, just to clarify, you're expected to go in there, and for those of you who may be familiar with the mythology around the Mahabharata, it's a kind of Draupadi Vastaharan. So a woman, I'm supposed to walk in there, there's this assembly of men and a few token ladies, and they will question me about my tweet, and I'm supposed to stand up there, defend it, explain it, and ideally apologize for it. So I did nothing of the kind. I said, to start with, it is not, it doesn't constitute as a privilege at all, because it's not commenting on the proceedings of the Legislative Assembly. I'm criticizing, and this has something to do with the government imposing a prime-time viewing for Marathi films in our multiplexes. Now, even if they had said, you know, time has to be reserved for Belgian cinema, I would have responded the same way. The government has no business to decide which movie is to be shown at prime time. So I had protested in print about that, through a tweet. That was considered an insult to Marathi pride, Maharashtrian, and I'm a Maharashtrian myself. So it made it doubly terrible. So then I said they'll probably ban popcorn next and insist on all of us eating vada pav and misal, which is a popular local snack. So that was taken as a huge offense to Maharashtrian cuisine. And they sent a mob of 400 strong protesters to my home. They circulated my mobile phone number and my address to the entire media, to all their supporters, volunteers, and political activists to say, come there and watch us humiliate her. They brought me dozens and dozens of vada pav, which is a popular sandwich snack, which they had said in their communication, they were going to shove down my throat and gag me. All of this, you know, over a silly tweet about primetime viewing of a movie. So this is the kind of, it's come to a stage where, not just in India, but perhaps elsewhere in other neighboring countries, that shall go nameless, and other countries that shall also go nameless, that, it's my intolerance is superior to your intolerance. Mine is better than yours. So, it's a question of like a war between whose intolerance wins. So at any rate, I moved the Supreme Court. I moved the Supreme Court challenging this whole process. And the Supreme Court ruled in my favor, but as things move in legal service, it just takes a little time. Now I think the next date when it's going to be put to bed forevermore, I hope, is coming up very soon in December. And for almost all of last year, I've been under police protection, which is not fun at all. So I have a gunman who is almost like become part of our family now. There are two of them, they take turns. And I treat them like, like I treat my sons. And I'm always worried, have they had their tea? Has a snack been sent to them? Have they had their lunch? Is it going to be a late night for them? Can they take the last train back, etc.? But this is not how it should be. It should be, there's something like free expression which everybody who respects free thinking and the rights as human beings ought to be respecting across the board, unless it's going to lead to violence and murder and on the streets or any kind of display that can lead to bloodshed and communal altercations. If that is not so, I think they should just leave us alone. That's it. Not just writers, not just bloggers, not just people, artists and cinema makers, but every citizen has the right to express himself or herself, and that is what we should cherish forever and ever, because without freedom there is nothing. Nothing at all. What are...
So I have two follow-up questions on that. One, where do you get the courage, or what makes you stand up and say these really, really important things when a lot of people don't? A lot of famous people don't, a lot of writers don't, a lot of cricketers don't, a lot of actors don't, and yet you do every single time. There was another quote I wanted to read out, and it was about a movie that recently came out about Salman Khan, who's a very well-respected actor, but is also about to go to jail for crimes he has committed. And you wrote, Salman Bhakt's come away worrying about just one question. Will his well-timed performance as an ambassador of peace and PR keep him out of jail? And I thought this was really timely because, yes, of course you want to appreciate an actor and everybody loves a good movie, but it was kind of crazy, wasn't it? All the people who wanted to go to jail on behalf of Salman. What's your reaction to all of that?
One can't explain a mass following of that kind. It is there. It's there with pop stars across the world. There are people who write the names of their favorite stars in blood, who are willing to actually die for them. And Salman Khan certainly has that kind of a following, and he's had it for the longest time. And in fact, his last film, which I really enjoyed, which has been trashed by the critics, by the way, but I enjoyed it and I said so, and I said Salman rules. One has to be fair, one has to, your entire professional credibility is built on just one thing, that people believe what you're saying is the truth, according to you. They may not agree with it, but they know it's an uncompromised opinion. Which is why when you ask me whether I have courage, I'm not a Joan of Arc, and I'm not ready to burn at the stake. It is doing what you believe is the right thing, to be able to stand up and to say it. And to say it in a way that is a reflection of popular opinion, not just your own opinion. It's what the citizens may be thinking, saying, believing, but they don't have a voice. Someone like myself, I do. So I see it as a privilege and a responsibility. So if I have that, I must learn to use it judiciously, but also to have a little fun from time to time. And you can always make the same point, whichever point you wish to make, using satire. You don't always have to hammer it home in a way that is crude and direct, and that can also antagonize a lot of people. Why do I do it and other celebrities, cricket people, sports people, politicians don't? I'll tell you why. My family and I, we are not looking for a free gas connection. We are not looking for a petrol pump to be assigned to us by the government. I'm not looking for a state award. They'll be mad even to consider me. I'm not looking for any national recognition. I'm not aligned to any political party. I am an independent person. I value my independence more than anything else. It means the world to me. So since I'm not looking for handouts from anybody, I can afford to say it. Movie stars cannot afford that. Cricket stars cannot afford that. There goes their endorsement deal, there goes the box office of their next movie, and there go the votes for politicians. So in that sense, I can also understand the commercial constraints they work with. They can, of course, choose, but they choose commerce over probably self-pride or a sense of what is right, and that sometimes it's very important to speak up. When a lot of people within your own community are being targeted or are being victimized, you are there as an icon representing whether it's the movie business or the cricketing world, and you stay mum. Well, I have less respect for those people, but it's their prerogative, it's their option.
Speaking of community, and sort of coming in and out of India and in and out of Bombay, I'm also from Bombay and very much consider myself a Bombay girl. It's really worrying to see the shrinking space for dissent. And it's especially worrying for me to see it in a place like Bombay, which really, its character and personality is really of everybody just coming there and trying really hard to survive and trying really hard to maybe make it. What are your thoughts on this? And very, very importantly, do you really think they're going to ban alcohol?
Gosh. Well, to answer your earlier question, and then we'll get to alcohol, that'll finish off Bombay. It'll sink without even a terrorist attacking us. So, you called yourself a Bombay girl. Trust me, you could perhaps attract arrest for saying that. You should have called yourself a Mumbai girl. I'm a Mumbai girl because there's now a move to change everything from the Bombay High Court to Mumbai High Court, the Bombay Gymkhana to the Mumbai Gymkhana. A newspaper called probably Bombay Times would be called Mumbai Times. So this is a kind of narrow-minded, parochial thinking which makes most of us very, very uncomfortable. Those of us who can resist it do. Those of us who want to play along, I guess we play along. But the atmosphere is definitely not what it was. Bombay was, I've just done a column on it. Like they said, Paris is the city of lights, was the city of lights, plunged into darkness. Well, Bombay was, is, and will always remain the city of dreams. And I don't think anybody has the right, or can, or has the authority, the power, or anything to kill our dreams. Nobody can kill anybody's dreams. So long as we have that spirit of buoyancy and optimism, that we see these crazy, some of them, as perhaps an aberration. Inshallah, an aberration. We think of them as nuisance value, like a thorn in the side. We hope and pray that they will somehow disappear, go away, disappear into the woodwork, and leave Mumbai alone to be the vibrant, fantastic, magnetic, electrifying city, an inclusive, cosmopolitan city where nobody but nobody ever thought in terms of who are you, what you eat, which community do you come from, which caste are you. I mean, if you were to ask my children these questions, they're so irrelevant, they wouldn't even know. You ask them which caste you belong to and they'll say, what? And that is modern India, that is young India. They want jobs, they want progress, they want Achhe Din in real terms. They're not concerned. I mean, this whole beef controversy which is spinning out of control, you invade the kitchens, you invade the bedrooms, what is left? So that has to be fought strenuously, and I'm glad to say there are enough voices out there, very influential, powerful voices. Whether it's the symbolism associated with returning awards, why not? You can mock it and say, what does it mean? It means a lot. What else can a writer or a filmmaker do to register protest? Not everybody can take to the streets, not everybody is an activist. This is your way of registering dissent, of saying, this is not right. We have to respect voices. We have to respect people.
If you could be the Prime Minister of India for a year, what would you do?
God help India. No, no, no. I'm not qualified for that job at all. I wouldn't ever dream of it. I love India too much.
Should we stop and take some questions?
I'd love that, but before that, please compliment me on my gamcha.
Could we have the MC come in with the mic? Is there somebody here who can hand around a mic? Yes?
Okay. Lights on. I'd love to see everybody in the audience. I can't see anyone. Oh wow, that's good. I wish I had my camera. I would take pictures of everybody from here.
Questions for Shobha De. All right.
Can you hear me? Okay. My name is Promit and I'm an oral surgeon. So my question, what I'm going to say is not a question, and it's neither a comment, but it lies somewhere between a question and a comment. So before going to that, I'd like to ask Ms. Ganguly that you have read out a lot of tweets. I came here late, so I don't know that whether or not you read out that tweet where Shobha De said, "I just ate beef. If you can, come and kill me." Okay.
I did.
Exactly. So, just imagine someone saying in Bangladesh that I just had pork and come and kill me. So you say something like this, then the backlash happens. In Twitter, there are a lot of people who go there, who show dissent, who comment, and then you cry out this victimhood. Oh, I've been attacked, intolerance, intolerance, and intolerance. And then you get to go to the Prime News Hour, that Arnab Goswami asks you, and you suddenly get your name into the headlines, and it's a very good thing. So where is intolerance when in 1984 there was this Sikh crowd and 3,000 people?
Please,
One second.
Please, it's a whole different discussion. 1984, we are not discussing 1984 and the Sikh riots, and you won't even know whether I was part of the protest at that time. So let's not get into the intolerance discussion. And we're not on Arnab Goswami's show right now.
Let me finish.
Get the mic away from her, all right?
You draw the line.
Get
we
the
can go
mic
back,
away from her.
centuries of intolerance there. Now it started with Tipu Sultan and the controversy over, so please, let's stick to something that's now. If you're asking me why I said that about the beef man, I felt so deeply pained and anguished with what had happened with Akla. That was my way of protesting. And what happened in Dadri pained me a lot.
Okay, were you also pained by the death of Mahesh Pujari?
Shall we move on to the next question?
I think I've answered you. Thank you.
So I realize you sidestepped the question on marriages and on marriage, but I'm going to ask you again. Do you think the institution of marriage is ended? Or I know you can answer that it needs to be transformed, but that's not like doesn't clarify things enough.
It cannot end. So that's a short response. That it will see itself mutating into different avatars, whether it's same-sex marriages. I just read about a threesome marriage, which has been registered, by the way, so it's official. It can be maybe a marriage, gang marriage coming up next, man, woman. So, marriage as an institution, I don't believe is doomed. So, it will be there. A lot of young people today that I'm, in fact, very happy to note, are going back to the more traditional version of marriage, because they believe that stability in their own lives and with their own children, and as a family, as a nuclear family, and extended to in the larger context of community and kutum, which is a beautiful word which goes beyond just meaning family, is definitely something that is under threat, and they want security, they want emotional stability, they want to raise their children with a sense of feeling that they're going to be loved, they're going to be looked after, they're going to prosper together as a family. So I don't see marriage really dying out, not here, not in the West, not anywhere.
But Shobha, how do you put together or wrestle with marriage and feminism. 2 years ago, there was a lot of interest in this article on women can't have it all. And there are a lot of questions around that, because in marriage often it is the woman who has to take and do a lot in addition to having a job, if she's allowed to have a job. So how do you pull those together?
I see men doing a lot too, you know. It's that they don't get the acknowledgement most of the time. So it's not fair to make them the villains of the peace in marriage, to make them villains of the peace in society, to keep sort of trashing them for not doing enough. I think we both have to pull together equally. And that's what a true partnership is about. It's not about I'm doing more and you're doing less and you're contributing more and you're contributing less. It's at the end of the day, it's got to be a common objective, a common goal. It's you're working towards something. And that something has to be meaningful to both of you equally. And just as women are working very hard, I mean, men are working very hard as well. So the idea of women playing victims all the time in marriages, in urban marriages, I'm not taking this argument to rural areas where, you know, the question of abuse, rape, inequality, women being invisible more or less after a certain age. That's a whole different, I'm not discussing that. I'm talking about urban marriages, the kind of marriages we probably see in this very auditorium. And those where the shift has taken place, some more shifts will take place. And I think on the whole, this may sound politically, well, incorrect, I'm happy to be. But when we talk about feminism, generally we equate it with the Western model of feminism. It's very different for people in this region what feminism actually means. And it was never a political movement in this region. It was never about, I want equal pay. Because we always had it, at least in India, constitutionally, you're guaranteed the same opportunities, the same pay scales, etc. It didn't always happen. Today it's happening more and more. The inequality, the injustice that we talk about, which is a conditioned response, more or less, over centuries of looking at women in a certain way, women looking at themselves in a certain way. So a lot of the time, I think a girl child grows up with feelings of perhaps inadequacy or somehow that she's going to be discriminated against, if not within her own family, then certainly when she's out there in the big bad world, which is out to somehow fix her, get her, show her her true place in society. But it's changing. I see it changing a lot. I see it in my children's generation. I see it with my daughters. I certainly see it with my granddaughters. I mean, I don't think they're the kind of little girls who are going to grow up with feelings of inadequacy. They take equality completely for granted, as every human being should, men and women.
That's
both.
fantastic. That's really fantastic. I have several questions, but I'm trying not to be selfish here. So are there other questions from the audience we can take? I think there's one over there, somebody in black.
It's fine. I'm Grace from Sri Lanka, and I just got here. I didn't even know this was happening, so I'm really happy. Okay, here we go. So, would you say that, in terms of feminism, I believe I'm a feminist myself, but what most people, they're more concerned with giving women more prominence and saying that it's men oppressing women. But would you agree that most of the time women oppress women and men oppress men, in the sense where guys aren't allowed to wear pink because they may seem gay, or they are not allowed to cry because it's emasculating?
I think the strong oppress the weak, period. So even in a marriage, if the woman happens to be the stronger partner, she'll oppress her husband, perhaps. And in a workplace, it's the same thing. So when we're talking about men oppressing other men in the workplace, it's normally the stronger, the alpha male who will do it, and an alpha female will do it too. I mean, what intrigues me is how the Clintons work out their marriage, because they're two alphas. So that is a question that I don't think the world has sufficiently been able to figure out how that equation would work long term.
Shobha, I had a question for you. So you have done so many different things in your life. You started out as a model, you've been an editor of a magazine, you're a writer, you're very prolific in newspapers and TV shows. How do you find the time, and then how do you sort of identify yourself outside the home? I know being a mother and being a wife is very important to you, but when you identify yourself as this is Shobha De, what do you go to?
You're making me laugh. I don't see it, I don't compartmentalize my life so clinically. This is who I am, take it or leave it, you know. I don't think of it in that way of dissecting my various roles and identities. Most of the time, I think I've got, like most of us, I'm sure, have 10 balls up in the air and you're just keeping your fingers crossed that you don't drop one of them. And it's a juggling act for women more sometimes than for men, especially women who are raising young children. It is difficult, it is very hard, and society that is not always simpatico with that. But I think we all kind of manage, and I enjoy that. I would hate the pace of my life. I'd hate to hit a speed breaker and have someone tell me, you know, and when one of my daughters, she does it all the time, she says, Mom, you need to slow down. And I ask her, but why? Does my speed bother you? So, you know, I don't know, it's sort of conditioning that you reach a certain age. I'm 67 years old, I like being my age, I have no problems with it. And if someone says, no, I don't need applause, please, that makes me feel terrible. What I mean is, why should age be a cage? Why should anybody, man or woman, start thinking old? You just be the way you are and enjoy every bit of your life and do as much as you can. Travel, drink, have fun, meet people, come to Lit Fest, engage with the young, learn, be curious. Everything should interest you, every little aspect of life, even that little leaf on that wonderful banyan tree outside. You should look at it and say, wow, I admire you, leaf. That means you are alive. And as long as those little reminders tell you life is worth living, I see no reason on earth to say full stop to anything.
Should we take more questions? There are lots of hands at the back. I want to let somebody else
You're not
decide.
getting a chance on this side. It's always on the other side.
Please, this side.
Let me also start on a not so serious note. May I also express my admiration, because recently you extracted some deference from Arnab Goswami, which I must say is no mean achievement. Having said that, the question that bothers many of us, particularly in our generation, which was the 60s, that many things that you described happening in our neighboring country was something that we were accustomed to, so elegantly described this afternoon by our respected Professor Rehman Soban, with authoritarian regimes that were not accounted for nor accountable. How come it is happening in a country which, in a matter of speaking, we are all proud of, for it's uninterrupted, regardless, despite the infirmities, despite the limitations? All forms of government have limitations and infirmities. Instead of progressing, we see a regress. If you look at the history of 47, since 47, you have after all had an accountable, representative, pluralist form of government. Have you reflected on this? Thank you. And again, for somebody who is 3 years older to me and it's still so beautiful, I am enchanted. Thank you very much.
The thing is, the party, BJP, and its leader were elected with a mandate that was unprecedented. That cannot be challenged. That is still a democratic process. You have to accept that. What happens after that mandate and what goes wrong once you have that kind of mandate is a different story. And even for that, there is an answer. If they don't deliver the way they were meant to, what they had promised, we still have the vote. Kick them out. That is the strength of a democracy. Every citizen has that sense of empowerment. And every citizen can and must speak up when they see something that they feel is unjust and horrible. So what you're talking about, the regressive aspects of the democracy, well, it depends completely on perspectives. There's a scholar, a historian, and a person whose mind I respect greatly right here, Ram Guha, and maybe he's better qualified to answer and respond to what you have said. I have been vocal, I've been critical, I have been allowed to be vocal and critical. Yes, morchas come to my house, but yes, I also get protection by the same state government. So that may not happen in other countries. I might have my head blown off. So there are things about India that are very complex, very hard to decode, very hard to deconstruct. It is a huge country, a hugely impossible country, an argumentative country, a contradictory country, all of that. But despite everything, what the Bihar elections once again established to all of us in India who are critical of the government is that you cannot fool the citizen. It was a huge vote and a huge, perhaps, slap in the face for the government in power, but it also was a huge, what would I call it, not just a learning curve, I don't know what else is left for them to learn, but certainly something, a wake-up call. And it, to me, it was also a great endorsement of the democratic process, that despite that mandate, despite the amount of money that was pumped into Bihar, despite it all, they still lost. And I think India has woken up, and Bihar was a testing ground. Let's see what happens in the next few elections, and that will give us a far better picture. And about regressive elements, you can see every single day that there are voices of dissent in one form or the other, speaking up constantly through movies, through paintings, through
giving
writing.
back awards.
The award Vapsi is just one of many such protests. So I'm very optimistic. I believe very strongly that the average Indian votes as much with his mind as with his heart. Any government that doesn't deliver, any government that diminishes the citizen will be kicked out. There's no question in my mind.
As a follow-up question to that, we've studied this, and I feel like I'm seeing it too to a certain extent, but do you see that there is a maturing of the Indian voter? If you look back to the 80s, if you look back to the 70s, what made people vote and what is making people vote now? Do you see that that's changing?
Well, social media, of course, has changed almost everything. It's changed the whole political landscape, not just of India, but of the whole world. And today, I mean, for example, the Arab Spring wouldn't have happened without a tweet. So the power of the tweet and the potency of what one sees on television and what the voices one hears across on Twitter and Facebook and so many other forms of self-expression. The young in India today are ambitious, they're restless, they really want change of a real kind. They're not interested in the politics of religion. They couldn't care less. So if any government, even with a mandate like the government in power today, if that is all they're going to offer the people, eat beef or don't eat beef, I'm sorry, but you know, the clock is ticking and they'd better be aware of that. And I'll give you a small example, like with the Bihar elections where almost everybody got it wrong, all the pundits got it wrong, all the various people on television channels who were analyzing various trends and making really ridiculous predictions, and the numbers, eventually everybody had a lot of egg on their faces. I was talking to my driver who's been with us for many years, he's from Bihar. He got it bang on. And he's an illiterate man. So I asked him, and he hasn't been back to Bihar for the last 3 years. So I asked him how. So he looks at me and he's like, I'm crazy, and he says, he's working that phone. and he's getting feedback from his village. And he said that, you know, for the last so many decades, whether it was during the Congress rule, later, with Nitish, with this one, with that one, with the BJP trying to muscle, he said nobody cared a damn about the people out there in the villages. Today I have a pakka road, I have electricity, I have water, my children are educated, I'm hoping they'll get into the army or the police so that we have a secure future for our family. I have a pakka home to live in. These are things I couldn't have dreamt of. Even 10 years ago, I wouldn't have imagined this to be possible. These are the
Especially
women of Bihar who voted, his wife, all the village women who she had also mobilized. He said that's going to change the election. This he said much before the results came out. So you see, sometimes the TV pundits should actually invite our guy, Chaudhary, on their channel, and they'll get a far more accurate, bang-on, ground level, picture of what's going on in the real India, not in the India of TV studios.
You've shot Chaudhary to fame now.
Deserves it.
Other questions? There's a request over there. Go ahead.
Kind of surprised nobody has complimented on the Gamsha yet, but you know. So I've just heard of you first time today, so I'm like, okay, cool. But the thing I liked was the comment you made about satire. So one of my favorite comedians, Trevor Noah of The Daily Show in the US, he said something, this is a quote that says that the war on bullshit. Because that's what I see like humorists doing, is the war on bullshit. But then there's this rule of thumb in comedians is that there's a line that, you know, you have to cross it to know where the line is. So my question to you is, like, whenever you're thinking about things and when you're writing in your humor, do you practice that? And also, as a prominent voice, do you feel a sense of where you're like, okay, I have to decide to be politically correct or incorrect? Do you have that?
Well, my column for the last, I think 25, 30 years is called Politically Incorrect. So that pretty much states my objective. I think the job of every writer or every creative person, essentially that's how I see it, has to be subversive. There's no point in writing otherwise. What's the point in writing, goody-goody stuff about how wonderful we all are? We're not all that wonderful, and it's about time we acknowledge that, and with all our flaws and our vulnerabilities and our frailties and everything else, the weaknesses and strengths, we must be able to find that humor within our own lives, in the life around us, or it'll become unbearable. I mean, it's a stressful enough world if we were to only focus on the negatives and think of all the terrible things out there. Like, for example, I was very keen to put it on my Facebook, and I realized that I can't from here. I was describing, I wrote a long Facebook piece on the smoked hilsha I had at lunch. And how, it's a trip back to Dhaka, just for that flavor, the velvety, wonderful, smoky, delicious, unbeatable. I don't know whether it's swimming upstream right now or wherever it's swimming, but wherever it's swimming, it was delicious. So, these are little joys which sometimes translate into much bigger joys. And satire and humor, you cannot practice it. At least I cannot, because I'm not a stand-up comedian, in which case you have to know your lines. I write from the heart. I write as truthfully as is possible. I try to write with a lot of responsibility, but yes, do I want to make a point? Yes, I want to make a point. Do I want to be read? Yes, I want to be read. Every writer in the world wants to be read. Do I want my tweets to reach a certain number of people? Of course I do. I'd be lying to say that, I'm writing really purely for myself, in which case I would be writing a personal diary, which also I do. Or I'd be sharing what I feel, what I believe, with like-minded people, and that would be a waste of time. It's if you're going to be preaching to the converted or talking to the converted, what thrill is there? I mean, dissent is the thrill. I mean, if 10 people out here got up and said, oh God, get off that stage, I mean, we don't believe a word of what you just said, and you're just so terrible, I'll wake up myself and pay attention and say, oh my God, was I really that terrible? I'll try and be better the next time or something. But passive kind of a response to any act in the public domain. Passive is death.
On that note, I've just been given our marching orders. Apparently we run terribly over time. So let me close this really, really wonderful session here with something that I've always really, really admired about you as somebody who writes as well. You are one of the few writers in India whose books stack up in shelves in the very stuffy, intellectually snobby bookshops in Bombay and Kolkata and Delhi. But you're also one of those authors whose books will be there on the little carts next to the chaiwalas in the dustiest, smallest railway station in India. So I really admire that about you, and here's to more of your books. Thank you.
Very much.